Far away, in the quiet corners of the galaxy, where the stars burn dimly and the echoes of forgotten times still linger, lies a story older than the worlds we know. In those distant half-remembered ages, a great empire ruled the stars. But now, that empire sleeps. Beneath the surface of many a lonely windswept planet, vast armies of silent warriors lie entombed, waiting. They are the Necrons, a people of metal and eternity, whose time, once thought past, may yet come again. The Necrons were not always so cold and deathless. Once, long ago, they were as flesh and blood as any other, though their lives were hard and brief. They were called the Necrontyr then, and theirs was a mournful existence, for they lived beneath a sun that was slowly dying. The light of that star brought them no warmth or comfort, only pain and the cruel certainty of death. Their lives were short, their bodies frail, and they looked upon the other races of the galaxy, especially the old ones, with envy, for those beings lived long and prospered under kinder stars. But the Necrontyr, bitter though they were also proud, and they were clever too. They built great cities and mighty ships that could sail between the stars, and so their empire grew, spreading out across the galaxy. Yet no matter how far they traveled, no matter how many worlds they conquered, they could not escape the shadow of death that followed them wherever they went. Their lives remained short and filled with suffering, and as their empire grew, so too did their anger and resentment. They longed for something more, something that would free them from the cruel fate of their mortality. It was in this desperate search for immortality that the Necrontyr found the C'tan, beings of pure energy who dwelt among the stars themselves. The Necrontyr, in their longing, believed these C'tan to be gods, for they seemed to possess the very thing the Necrontyr desired above all else: eternity. One of the C'tan, a cunning and deceptive entity, offered the Necrontyr a bargain. He promised them life everlasting, freedom from the burdens of their failing flesh, in exchange for their loyalty and service. The Necrontyr, blinded by their desperation, accepted the C'tan's offer, without fully understanding what they had agreed to. And so the terrible transformation began. The C'tan used their vast powers to strip the Necrontyr of their fragile bodies, replacing them with cold, gleaming metal. No longer would they age or die. Their new forms were eternal, impervious to the passage of time or the ravages of war. But in gaining immortality, the Necrontyr lost something far greater: their very souls. Now, as Necrons, they are little more than empty vessels, their once vibrant minds dulled to little more than dim echoes of what they had been. They serve the ancient lords of their empire, marching in perfect, silent ranks, their eyes glowing with a cold, unfeeling light. And though they are mighty, though their technology is far beyond anything that the younger races of the galaxy can comprehend, there is a sadness to their existence. They are eternal, yes, but they are also alone, cut off from the warmth of life, trapped in bodies that can never know the joy of being alive. Still they wait, beneath the sands of 1,000 worlds, in tombs that have lain sealed for millions of years. The Necrons slumber. The galaxy, it seems, has forgotten them, and yet, deep in the dark, they stir. Their time may yet come again, for the Necrons are patient. They have all the time in the universe. This is their story. Far across the stars, on a world where no warmth could be found, and where the light of a dying sun cast long twisted shadows, there lived a people known as the Necrontyr. Their existence was a grim and bitter one, for their very homes seemed to conspire against them. The skies above were not blue, but a sickly yellow-grey, and the air carried the taste of radiation, always there, always gnawing at them. The Necrontyr were born into pain, and lived brief, harsh lives, their bodies frail and twisted by the cruel touch of their star. They had once been like other races, with the hope of life and the joy of days that stretched into years. But as their star began to wither and fail, So too did their bodies, becoming more fragile with each passing generation. Death to them was not a distant shadow, but a constant companion, one that took them far too soon, leaving only sorrow behind. They were a proud and intelligent people. They had built great cities that gleamed under the pale light of their sun, with spires that reached up toward the heavens as if in defiance of the doom that hung over them. They crafted mighty machines and studied the stars, their minds sharp and filled with longing for a future that seemed ever out of reach. But for all their brilliance, for all their achievements, they could not escape the one truth that defined them. Their lives were fleeting, and no matter how hard they tried, they were always running out of time. In those long, desperate days, the Necrontyr grew to hate the very universe itself. They gazed upon the stars with envy, for beyond their cursed world, they knew that other races thrived in the light of young, healthy suns. Most of all, they despised the old ones, the ancient and powerful beings who, as far as the Necrontyr knew, had no such burdens. The old ones lived for centuries, perhaps even millennia. Their lives long and full, untouched by the ravages of sickness or the decay of their bodies. To the Necrontyr, the old ones became a symbol of everything that had been denied to them, everything they had lost to the cruelty of their dying son. Bitter as they were not content to simply fade away. They could not bear the thought of living such short, painful lives while the rest of the galaxy flourished. So they set their sights on the stars. If their world had failed them, perhaps there was something out there, something that could save them from their fate. They became skilled astronomers and engineers, and soon their minds turned toward the dream of empire. And so the Necrontyr built ships, great lumbering vessels that could traverse the stars, cold and silent like their creators. These ships carried them to new worlds, worlds with rich, fertile land and bright suns. But no matter how far they traveled, no matter how many planets they conquered, they could not escape the inevitable. Their lives remained short, their bodies continued to fail, and each new generation seemed more fragile than the last. Stubborn and proud, pressed on. Their empire grew, stretching out across the stars, a grim testament to their will to survive. They built grand monuments on every world they claimed, towering structures of metal and stone that stood as a challenge to the universe itself, as if to say, "We are still here." Yet even as their empire grew, so too did the troubles within. The Necrontyr had conquered many worlds, but their victories brought them no closer to the one thing they truly sought, freedom from the grasp of death. And with each passing generation, as their lives grew shorter and their bodies weaker, the internal divisions within their empire deepened. The rulers of the Necrontyr, known as the dynasts, were constantly at odds with one another. Their short lifespans made it difficult to maintain stability, for no sooner had one dynasty risen to power than it would fall, its leaders taken by illness or old age. New rulers would emerge full of ambition, only to be swept away by the same cruel fate. In time, the Necrontyr Empire became a patchwork of warring factions, each dynasty fighting to preserve its own fleeting existence, while the great vision of a unified people slowly crumbled. It was in this time of strife and despair that a single ruler rose above the others. His name was Szarekh, but he would come to be known as the Silent King, for his wisdom lay not in speeches or grand declarations, but in the quiet strength of his resolve. Szarekh saw what the other dynasts could not, that their endless fighting and bitterness would be the ruin of them all. He sought to unite the Necrontyr under one banner, to restore some semblance of order to their fractured empire. Under Szarekh's rule, the Necrontyr began to look beyond their petty squabbles. Once again, they turned their eyes toward the stars, toward the endless expanse of space that lay before them. Szarekh was not content with the slow, inevitable decline of his people. He knew that somewhere, beyond the reach of their dying star, there must be an answer, a way to escape the curse of their mortality. The Necrontyr, once a people on the brink of collapse, now stood united under Sarekh's leadership. But even as their empire grew stronger, their suffering only deepened, and with each passing day, their longing for immortality became more desperate. They knew that their time was running out, but they did not yet know just how terrible the price of immortality would be. Under the weak light of their dying sun, the Necrontyr looked upon the stars with bitter longing, their hearts filled with envy and resentment. They had watched their own world grow ever colder, ever more hostile, and they knew their fragile bodies could not last long in such a place. It was not just their own mortality that haunted them. It was the knowledge that, across the stars, other races lived under bright suns, free from the cruel grip of death that seemed to tighten around the Necrontyr with every passing generation. For all their suffering, the Necrontyr were a proud people. They were not content to wait quietly for the end. No, the Necrontyr had ambition, and they would not let the universe take them so easily. Their minds, as sharp and unyielding as the metal spires of their cities, turned toward the idea of escape. If their world was a tomb, they would not remain entombed. And so they built great ships unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. These starships were massive, looming structures of cold metal, built with the precision and grim determination that had become the hallmark of their race. The Necrontyr, with their ever-advancing technology, learned to harness the energies of the cosmos itself, and they set out to conquer the stars. With the same resilience that had allowed them to survive the brutal conditions of their homeworld, they pushed out into the void, determined to carve out a place for themselves in the galaxy, no matter the cost. And so the Necrontyr Empire was born. From their dying homeworld, the Necrontyr expanded their reach, spreading to distant planets that orbited younger, healthier stars. These new worlds, rich with life and resources, were nothing like the desolation they had left behind. But the Necrontyr did not find joy in their new dominions. Their hearts were still heavy with the knowledge that no matter how far they traveled, no matter how many worlds they brought under their rule, the curse of their mortality followed them. They could build new cities, raise new monuments to their power, but their bodies would still fail them, just as they always had. The new worlds they conquered fell easily before them, for the Necrontyr were a force driven not just by ambition, but by desperation. The lesser races they encountered could not withstand the might of the Necrontyr legions, armed as they were with the most advanced weapons and technologies the galaxy had ever seen. Their enemies were overwhelmed by the cold precision of their tactics, the relentless march of their armies. The Necrontyr were like a force of nature, inevitable, unstoppable. Planets surrendered to them, and soon their empire spanned across the stars, its borders ever expanding. But even as their empire grew, so too did the tensions within. For all their intelligence and ingenuity, the Necrontyr could not escape the shadow of their own mortality. Their leaders, the dynasts, ruled for only a short time before their failing bodies betrayed them. Every ruler who took power knew that his reign would be brief, that soon enough he too would fall victim to the same sickness, the same rapid decay that had claimed those before him. And so, in the corridors of power, endless rivalries and conflicts emerged. The dynasts, each more ambitious than the last, fought not just for control of the empire, but for the right to leave a lasting mark on a galaxy that would soon forget them. No sooner had one dynasty taken control of a world than another would rise, challenging their right to rule. With every transition of power, the empire was shaken by internal strife. Entire star systems were plunged into civil war as the dynasties clashed, their rulers desperate to extend their legacies in the brief time they were given. For all its outward power, the Necrontyr Empire was a fragile thing, built on a foundation of envy and fear. The Necrontyr had conquered much, but they had gained little. Their suffering had not ended. It had only spread across the stars along with them. The rival dynasties saw their empire as a prize to be fought over, a fleeting moment of glory in a galaxy that would soon forget them. In their desperation, they tore at one another, fracturing the unity that had allowed them to build such an empire in the first place. Yet amidst the chaos, there was one among them who saw the truth of their situation. Szarekh, the Silent King, understood that their empire could not survive if it remained divided. He was not like the other dynasts who fought and schemed for personal power. Szarekh saw further. He saw the inevitability of their downfall if they continued down this path. And so, with quiet determination, he set about the task of uniting the dynasties under his rule. It was no easy task. The dynasts, proud and stubborn, were not eager to bend the knee to any one ruler. But Szarekh, patient and wise, moved carefully. He forged alliances where he could and crushed resistance where he had to. Slowly but surely, the Silent King brought the Necrontyr Empire under his control, his quiet strength and vision a stark contrast to the chaos that had come before. Under Sharekh's rule, the empire began to stabilize. The civil wars that had plagued the Necrontyr slowed, and the dynasties, once so fiercely divided, started to fall into line. For the first time in many generations, the Necrontyr could look beyond their internal squabbles and focus on the galaxy that still lay before them, waiting to be conquered. But even as their empire grew stronger, Szarekh knew that it was only a temporary solution. The real problem, death, still hung over them, as unavoidable as ever. The Necrontyr had conquered the stars, but their frailty remained, gnawing away at their future. And so, under Sharekh's reign, the search for a way to defeat death became the Empire's true purpose. The Necrontyr would not rest until they had found the answer to the curse that had haunted them for so long. It was this quest, this desperate longing for immortality, that would set them on the path to their ultimate fate, though none could foresee the terrible cost it would demand. Out among the dark spaces between the stars, where the light of distant suns flickered faintly against the vast cold of the void, the Necrontyr sought answers. Their empire, though mighty, still carried the curse of their frailty, the unavoidable reminder that they were bound to short, painful lives. Even under the rule of Szarekh, the Silent King, who had brought unity where there had once been only strife, the Necrontyr still looked upon the galaxy with a bitter longing, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that their suffering had no end. It was during this time of desperate searching that they made a discovery, unlike any they had made before. For in the cold expanse of the void, far beyond the reach of any living thing, the Necrontyr encountered beings of such unimaginable power that they were beyond the comprehension of mere mortals. These were the C'tan, the star gods. It began with the Necrontyr's astronomers, those who had always sought to study the stars, not only for knowledge, but in the hope that somewhere in the galaxy there might be an answer to the curse of their mortality. Their instruments were the finest in the Empire, capable of peering deep into the darkness between the stars, and it was in these depths that they noticed something strange. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a ripple, a faint disturbance in the flow of energy from a distant star, something so small and subtle that many might have missed it. But the Necrontyr were a race accustomed to paying attention to even the smallest details, for they had learned that in such things might lie the key to their survival. And so, the astronomers studied the ripple, their curiosity piqued. What they discovered astonished them. It was not a natural phenomenon, not the movement of celestial bodies or the pulse of some dying star. No, this disturbance had intent behind it, a deliberate bending of the energies of the universe. They had never seen anything like it before, and with growing excitement, they reported their findings to Szarekh himself. The Silent King, ever watchful for anything that might bring hope to his people, took great interest in the astronomer's discovery. He ordered that their findings be investigated further, and so the Necrontyr sent out an expedition to the region of space where the disturbance had been detected. It was a perilous journey, for the place where the ripple had been found was a region of space rarely traveled, cold, distant, and lifeless. But the Necrontyr were determined, and they pressed on. When they arrived at the location, they found something more wondrous and terrifying than they could have ever imagined. It was there, in the dark spaces between the stars, that they encountered the C'tan for the first time. These beings, these star gods, were unlike anything the Necrontyr had ever seen. They were vast, immense creatures made not of flesh and blood, but of energy, pure, radiant energy that shimmered and pulsed with the light of the stars themselves. They drifted through the void like living nebulae, their forms shifting and changing as they moved, their presence bending the fabric of the universe around them. The Necrontyr, in their ships, could only watch in awe as the C'tan passed before them, immense and terrible. These beings were not bound by the laws of nature as the Necrontyr understood them. They were beyond such things. Where they passed, the very light of the stars seemed to twist and writhe, as though the universe itself bent to their will. At first, the Necrontyr did not understand what they were seeing. They had never encountered such beings before, and the sight of the C'tan filled them with a mixture of awe and terror. But as they watched, they realized that these creatures were not merely drifting aimlessly through space. No, the C'tan were feeding. They fed on the light of the stars, drawing the energy of the suns into themselves, consuming it to fuel their own existence. The Necrontyr, with their minds always turning toward survival, saw something more than mere spectacle. Here, in these vast, star-devouring beings, might lie the answer they had been seeking for so long. These star gods seemed to be immortal, boundless in their energy, untouched by the decay that plagued the Necrontyr. If they could harness the power of the C'tan, if they could somehow forge an alliance with these beings, perhaps they could finally escape the curse of their short lives. The Necrontyr returned to Szarekh with tales of what they had seen. The Silent King listened carefully, his mind calculating the possibilities. He had always known that the answer to their suffering would not come easily. And now, in the C'tan, he saw both a hope and a danger. These beings were powerful, far beyond anything the Necrontyr could have ever imagined, but they were also alien and unknowable. To deal with such creatures was to invite great risk, but Szarekh, burdened by the knowledge that his people's time was running out, was willing to take that risk. It was the Deceiver who came to them first. Of all the C'tan, the Deceiver was the most cunning, the most insidious. He took on a form that the Necrontyr could comprehend, a vast, towering figure made of shimmering light, his features vaguely humanoid, but ever shifting, as though they could never quite settle into one shape. His voice, when he spoke, was like the crackling of distant stars, full of power and promises. The Deceiver offered the Necrontyr what they had long sought. He spoke of immortality, of the power to cast off their failing bodies and rise above the curse of death that had haunted them for so long. He promised that with the aid of the C'tan, the Necrontyr could become something greater than they had ever imagined, something beyond the reach of time and decay. The Silent King, cautious as ever, listened to the Deceiver's words with a mixture of hope and suspicion. The promise of immortality was tantalizing, but Szarekh had seen enough of the galaxy to know that such gifts rarely came without a price. The Deceiver, for all his shining grandeur, was still a being of immense and terrible power, and Szarekh knew that such power could never be trusted lightly. But the Necrontyr were desperate. They had built an empire, conquered worlds, and risen to the heights of power, but none of it had brought them the peace they so longed for. Their bodies still decayed, their lives still ended far too soon, and now, here before them, was the promise of a solution. The C'tan, offered them a way to escape death itself. In the end, it was not merely the deceiver's promises that swayed Szarekh. It was the thought of his people, of the millions of Necrontyr, whose lives were slipping away like sand through fingers. The Silent King had spent his life trying to find a way to save them, to free them from the curse that had been placed upon them by their dying son. Could he really refuse this chance, no matter how dangerous it might be? And so, Szarekh made the fateful decision. The Necrontyr would ally themselves with the C'tan. They would accept the Star God's offer and take the path that had been laid before them. It was a decision born of desperation, but it was a decision that would change the fate of the Necrontyr forever. For the C'tan had made their offer, but they had not revealed the true cost of what they were about to give. In the cold halls of his palace, beneath the dim dying sun of their homeworld, Szarekh, the Silent King, brooded over the weight of his choices. He had listened to the words of the deceiver, heard the promises of immortality whispered like sweet poison in the vast void between the stars. And still, his heart was troubled. For though the Necrontyr had long yearned for freedom from the cruel grasp of death, Szarekh, wise beyond his years, knew that gifts from beings as powerful as the C'tan were seldom given freely. But Szarekh was not a man driven by fear. He had led the Necrontyr out of the chaos of internal strife, uniting the fractured dynasties of their empire and forging them into a single ironclad force. He had weathered the storm of rebellion and division, had seen the bitterness and envy in the eyes of his rivals, and had conquered it all. Now, in the twilight of his people, he faced a decision that could save the Necrontyr from the doom that hung over them, or condemn them to a fate far worse. The C'tan had appeared like gods in the darkness, beings of light and power that consumed the very essence of stars. The Silent King had seen them with his own eyes, vast radiant creatures who moved through the void as though the laws of the universe bent to their will. They offered what the Necrontyr had always desired, eternal life, an escape from the frailty of their dying bodies. Yet Szarekh, ever cautious, knew that such power could not be wielded without consequence. The deceiver, the most cunning of the C'tan, had spoken with a voice that crackled like the burning of distant suns. He had come to Szarekh with an offer that seemed too good to refuse. The Necrontyr, the deceiver claimed, could rise above their cursed mortality. They could cast off their fragile flesh and ascend to a state of undying perfection. The Silent King had listened, silent as always, his thoughts hidden behind his inscrutable gaze. The court of Szarekh had been divided on the matter. Some, particularly the dynasts who had long ruled the Necrontyr's far-flung worlds, were eager to accept the C'tan offer. Their desperation for a way out of their mortality was palpable. They had ruled over empires, commanded fleets of ships that crossed the stars, and conquered worlds in the name of the Necrontyr. But for all their power, they could not escape the one truth that haunted them. Their lives were short, and no amount of wealth or conquest could extend their days. They saw the C'tan as saviors, and they urged Szarekh to accept their gift without hesitation. Others were more cautious. There were those among the Necrontyr who feared the C'tan, who whispered of the danger that came with aligning themselves with such beings. These star gods, though powerful, were not creatures of kindness or mercy. They fed on the energy of the stars themselves, consuming the light of suns as easily as a man might draw breath. To ally with such beings was to play with forces that the Necrontyr could barely comprehend. But their voices, though measured and wise, were few, drowned out by the overwhelming clamor of those who longed for the eternal life the C'tan promised. Szarekh heard it all, the pleas and the warnings, the cries of desperation, and the murmurs of doubt. But still, he remained silent. He had not risen to power by acting in haste, nor by giving in to the fears of those around him. He had always been a ruler who weighed his decisions carefully, who saw the path ahead when others were blinded by the moment. and so he withdrew, as was his custom, to consider the matter in solitude. Alone in his chambers, Szarekh paced the cold floors, his mind churning with thoughts of what lay ahead. The Necrontyr had suffered for so long, their bodies twisted by the cruel radiation of their sun, their lives cut short by the frailty that had cursed them for generations. He knew the pain of his people. He had felt it himself in the failing strength of his limbs, in the slow decay that touched every Necrontyr in time. And he had seen it in the eyes of the dynasts, those proud rulers whose ambitions were always tempered by the knowledge that their reigns would be brief. But Szarekh also knew something else, a truth that weighed heavily on him. The Necrontyr were not just a people cursed by death, they were a people divided by it. Their short lives had driven them to endless conflict, as each new generation sought to make its mark on the galaxy before time ran out. The dynasties warred with one another, their rivalries tearing at the fabric of the empire. Szarekh had fought hard to bring them together, to unite the Necrontyr under one banner, but he knew that their unity was fragile. It had been built on fear, fear of death, fear of the future, and fear, Szarekh knew, could only hold an empire together for so long. The C'tan offered a way out, not just from death, but from the divisions that had plagued the Necrontyr for so long. With eternal life, there would be no more dynastic rivalries, no more wars of succession. The Necrontyr could finally stand united, freed from the terror of their short lives, and their empire could stretch out across the stars, unchallenged and eternal. It was a vision that tempted Szarekh, for he had always dreamed of an empire that could endure the ravages of time. But still the Silent King hesitated. He had seen the C'tan, their vast forms devouring the light of stars, their hunger endless and terrifying. He knew that such beings could not be trusted, no matter how sweetly they spoke. The Deceiver, for all his promises of immortality, was named such for a reason. He was a creature of manipulation and trickery, and Szarekh could feel the weight of his lies pressing against the edges of his mind. Yet what choice did he have? The Necrontyr were dying, and their time was running out. If Szarekh did nothing, his people would fade into the darkness of history, their empire crumbling to dust, forgotten by the galaxy. He could not allow that to happen. He had sworn to save his people, to lead them to a future where they could thrive. But at what cost? For days Szarekh deliberated, walking the cold halls of his palace, his mind torn between hope and dread. He spoke to no one, not even his closest advisors. The fate of the Necrontyr rested on his decision, and it was not a burden he could share. In the end, it was not the promise of immortality that swayed him, nor the fear of the C'tan's power. It was the knowledge that, without action, the Necrontyr were doomed. Szarekh returned to his court, his decision made. He stood before the assembled dynasts, his silent presence commanding their attention, and spoke in a voice that was calm and steady, though the weight of his words would change the fate of his people forever. "We shall accept the C'tan's offer," Szarekh said, his gaze sweeping across the room. There were gasps of relief from some, murmurs of fear from others, but Szarekh did not waver. "We shall take the path to immortality, and in doing so, we shall rise above the curse that has held us in chains for so long." The dynasts bowed their heads in acceptance, though fear still flickered in their eyes. Szarekh could see it, those who doubted, those who feared the price they would pay. But the decision had been made. The Necrontyr would place their fate in the hands of the C'tan, and the Empire would march toward a future that none could foresee. As Szarekh turned away, the Deceiver's promises echoed in his mind, and for the first time, a shadow of doubt crept into his heart. The Silent King, for all his wisdom and strength, knew that this path would not be an easy one, but it was the only path left to them. And so, with the weight of the future pressing down on his shoulders, Szarekh led the Necrontyr into the embrace of the C'tan, unaware of the terrible price that lay ahead. The Necrontyr had made their decision. The Silent King had spoken, and the dynasties, desperate for escape from their cursed mortality, had bowed to his will. Now, across the Empire, preparations were being made for a ceremony unlike any other, a ceremony that would change the fate of the Necrontyr forever. It began in the cold halls of the Necrontyr's greatest cities, where the towering machines of biotransference were assembled. These machines, designed under the guidance of the C'tan, stood like massive looming figures of metal and energy. Their intricate mechanisms pulsed with power, humming softly as they awaited the moment when they would be activated. Their purpose was simple: to strip the Necrontyr of their frail, failing bodies and transfer their minds into new forms, forms of living metal that would never age, never weaken, never die. The C'tan themselves watched with an almost detached interest, their vast, radiant forms drifting in the skies above the cities, their eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowing with cold light. To them, this was merely another act of feeding, another step in their endless quest for power. They had promised the Necrontyr immortality, and in return, they would consume the very essence of their souls. Across the Empire, the Necrontyr gathered in their millions, summoned to the great halls where the biotransference would take place. There was a strange mixture of emotions in the air. Some felt hope, a flicker of anticipation that this would finally be the answer to their prayers, the release from the suffering that had plagued them for so long. Others were fearful, their hearts heavy with dread as they gazed upon the machines that would soon consume their very beings. But no one spoke of turning back. Szarekh's decision was law, and the Necrontyr would follow it, no matter the cost. In the capital city, where Szarekh himself presided over the ceremony, the mood was somber. The Silent King stood at the front of the hall, his eyes fixed on the great machines before him. He had led his people to this moment, had promised them freedom from the chains of mortality, and now that moment had come. But as he watched the preparations unfold, a shadow passed over his heart. For all the power of the C'tan, for all their promises, Szarekh could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The machines of biotransference hummed louder now, their energy building as the first of the Necrontyr stepped forward. They were the dynasts, the rulers of the Empire, those who had been first to embrace the promise of the C'tan. Their faces were set in grim determination as they walked toward the machines, their bodies frail and decaying from the effects of their dying sun. They had ruled vast territories, commanded fleets and conquered worlds, but they had always known that their reigns would be short. Now they would cast off those frail bodies and become something eternal. The first dynast stepped into the machine. There was a moment of stillness, a collective breath held by all those watching. And then the machine roared to life. It was a sound like nothing they had ever heard before, a low, deep rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hall. The machine began to glow, a blinding light that engulfed the dynast within. For a moment there was silence, and then a scream. It was not the scream of a man in pain, nor even the scream of fear. It was something far worse, a scream of utter loss, of something being torn from the very fabric of existence. The dynast's body was consumed by the light, and the sound of the scream echoed through the hall, sending a shiver down the spine of every Necrontyr who heard it. And then it was over. The light faded, the scream cut off as suddenly as it had begun. The dynast was gone, his body reduced to nothing but dust. But in his place, standing in the center of the machine, was something new. The figure that emerged from the machine was tall, its form sleek and metallic. Its body was made of the same living metal that the C'tan had promised, a gleaming silvery substance that pulsed faintly with energy. Its eyes, glowing green with an unearthly light, scanned the room with a cold, calculating gaze. It was the same dynast, and yet it was not. The soul that had once animated him was gone, consumed by the C'tan in the process of biotransference. What remained was a shell, a mind encased in metal, free from the burdens of flesh, but also stripped of its essence. The Necrontyr in the hall stood in stunned silence, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and horror. This was what they had asked for, what they had longed for, and yet, as they gazed upon the metal form of their once-flesh ruler, many felt a deep unease. There was something missing, something vital that had been lost in the transformation. The dynast, though immortal, was no longer truly alive. Szarekh watched, his face impassive, but inside his heart grew heavy. He had seen the truth of what had happened, though none dared speak it aloud. The C'tan had delivered on their promise, yes, but in doing so, they had taken more than just the bodies of the Necrontyr. They had taken their very souls, feeding on the essence of their being, leaving behind only cold, empty shells. But it was too late to stop now. The process had begun, and there was no turning back. One by one, the dynasts stepped into the machines, each emerging as a towering figure of metal, their minds intact, but their souls consumed. And then it was the turn of the soldiers, the warriors who had fought so many battles in the name of the Empire. They too entered the machines, their screams of anguish filling the halls as the light of the biotransference consumed them. The transformation was total. Across the Empire, the Necrontyr were stripped of their flesh and remade in the image of the C'tan's promise. The living metal of their new bodies shimmered in the light of their once-dying sun, their green eyes glowing with the cold light of eternity. But with every scream, with every new Necrontyr lost to the process, it became clearer that something had been stolen from them, something that could never be returned. In the capital, Szarekh remained silent, watching as his people were transformed into these new beings, beings that would soon be known as the Necrons. His heart was heavy with the weight of his decision, the knowledge that he had condemned his people to an eternity without souls. The C'tan had promised immortality, and they had delivered, but at a price far higher than any Necrontyr had foreseen. The ceremony continued for days, the machines working ceaselessly to transform the entire population of the Necrontyr. The skies above were filled with the shimmering forms of the C'tan, their vast radiant bodies feeding on the energy that the biotransference released. They consumed the souls of the Necrontyr, growing ever more powerful as the empire they had once served was transformed into something new. When the last Necrontyr had passed through the machines, when the final scream had echoed through the halls and faded into silence, the ceremony was complete. The Necrontyr were no more. In their place stood the Necrons, immortal, eternal, and soulless. Their bodies, made of living metal, would never age, never decay, and they would serve their rulers without question, for they had no will of their own. Only the highest ranking among them retained any semblance of individuality, their minds sharp, but their souls lost. Szarekh, the Silent King, stood among them, his own transformation complete. He too had been remade, his body now a towering figure of metal and power. But as he gazed out at the legions of Necrons that filled the halls of his capital, his heart was filled not with triumph, but with sorrow. The Necrontyr had escaped death, yes, but they had lost something far greater. And so the Silent King stood, surrounded by his new empire of metal, his people transformed into something both greater and lesser than they had once been. The ceremony was over, the biotransference complete. The Necrontyr had become the Necrons, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The halls that once echoed with the voices of the Necrontyr now stood in cold, unbroken silence. In place of a people of flesh and bone, there were now only the Necrons, metallic, soulless, and eternal. The process of biotransference had been completed, and across the vast empire of the Necrontyr, no living being remained untouched. The ancient cities, once alive with the bustling energy of a doomed but ambitious race, were now filled with the gleaming bodies of the Necrons, each one motionless, waiting for the command to serve. At first glance, the transformation might have seemed like a victory. The bodies of the Necrons were tall and powerful, their metallic forms shimmering with the light of their necrodermis. Their frail, decaying flesh had been replaced by something that could not be broken, something that would not age or fail. And yet, for all the promise of immortality that had driven them to this point, the reality of what they had become was far darker. As the Necrontyr had stepped into the machines of biotransference, they had not only shed their physical forms, they had also lost something far more precious. The screams that had filled the air during the ceremony were not merely the cries of pain. They were the sounds of something deeper being torn away. Their souls, the very essence of who they were, had been consumed by the Catan, leaving behind only the cold logic of the mind and the unforgiving strength of metal. What emerged from the biotransference machines were beings that no longer knew fear, pain, or joy. They no longer knew hope or despair, love or hatred. The emotions that had once defined the Necrontyr had been stripped away, leaving only the blank, unfeeling gaze of the Necrons. In exchange for immortality, they had surrendered their souls, and with that surrender came the loss of everything that had made them individuals. The Silent King, Szarekh, walked through the halls of his capital, his own footsteps echoing in the cold, empty corridors. He was now a Necron himself, his once frail body replaced by a towering figure of living metal. His mind was sharp, his body strong, but he could feel the hollowness within him, a vast, echoing emptiness where his soul had once been. He had gained eternal life, as had all of his people, but at what cost? As he passed through the rows of his newly transformed legions, Szarekh could see the truth of what had been lost. The Necrontyr had once been a divided people, their short lives filled with conflict and ambition, each dynast struggling to leave a mark on the galaxy before death claimed them. But now, those same rulers stood silent, their individuality erased by the biotransference. Only the highest ranking among them retained even a fraction of their former selves, and even that was but a dim echo of what they had once been. The soldiers who had once fought so fiercely for the Empire, who had bled and died in battle with pride and purpose, now stood motionless, waiting for the command to serve. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes glowing with a faint green light, devoid of the fire that had once driven them. They no longer fought for glory, for family, or for honor. They fought because they had been commanded to fight, and nothing more. Szarekh knew that this was what the Catan had intended all along. The Star Gods had given the Necrontyr what they had asked for, immortality, but in doing so, they had also claimed their souls. The Necrons were now slaves to their own bodies, bound to serve the will of their rulers without question, without thought. They had been granted eternal life, but it was a life without freedom, without joy, without meaning. In the days following the biotransference, the full weight of what had been done began to settle over the Necron Empire. The dynasts, those who had once vied for power and influence, now stood in silence, their ambitions erased by the cold logic of their new forms. There were no more rivalries, no more political maneuvering. The dynasties that had once fought for control of the empire now existed only to serve Szarekh, their individuality lost to the unity of their new metallic forms. And it was not just the rulers who had been stripped of their identities. The common people, those who had once filled the streets and cities of the Necrontyr Empire, had been transformed as well. In the new order of the Necrons, there was no distinction between the high and the low. All were equal in their servitude, bound by the same cold, mechanical obedience to the Silent King and his lieutenants. It was a strange and hollow victory for Szarekh. He had sought to save his people from the inevitable decay of their bodies, from the curse of their dying sun, and in that he had succeeded. The Necrontyr were gone, but the Necrons would live forever. But what kind of life was this? The endless existence of the Necrons was one of eternal servitude, their once vibrant personalities lost to the cold logic of their new forms. Szarekh himself had been spared the worst of it, as had the other high-ranking rulers and warlords of the Empire. He still retained his mind, his memories, his awareness of what had been sacrificed. But even he could feel the change within himself, the dulling of his emotions, the loss of the spark that had once driven him. He was now something less than what he had been, even as his body had become something far greater. He could not help but look upon his people with a deep and growing sorrow. The Necrontyr had been a proud race, driven by ambition and passion, and though their lives had been short, they had lived them fully. But now, as Necrons, that fire had been extinguished. They were eternal, yes, but they were also empty, their lives reduced to nothing more than the carrying out of orders, the endless cycle of servitude that would stretch on for millennia. The C'tan, meanwhile, revelled in their victory. They had consumed the souls of the Necrontyr, feasting on the essence of their being, growing ever more powerful as the empire they had once served was transformed into a cold, unfeeling machine. The Necrons, for all their strength, were now little more than tools in the hands of the C'tan, their existence bound to the will of the star gods. But Szarekh, the Silent King, was not blind to what had happened. He had seen the true cost of the pact they had made, and though he had led his people into this dark transformation, he would not allow them to remain enslaved forever. In his heart, a seed of rebellion began to take root. He could not undo what had been done. There was no way to return the Necrontyr to their former selves, no way to recover the souls that had been lost. But there might yet be a way to break free from the control of the C'tan. For now, Szarekh kept his thoughts to himself. He ruled over his new empire with the same cold, calculated wisdom that had always guided him, knowing that the time for rebellion had not yet come. But he watched the C'tan closely, and in the cold halls of his capital he began to plan. The Necrons were slaves to the star gods, bound by the chains of their own immortality. But Szarekh, though silent, had not given up. The C'tan had taken their souls, but the Silent King would find a way to take something back. And when the time came, the Necrons would rise not as servants, but as masters of their own destiny. For now, though, the Necron Empire marched in silence, its legions of metal warriors bound to serve, their individuality lost, their will subsumed by the endless, unfeeling logic of their new forms. The Necrontyr were gone, and the Necrons had taken their place, eternal in their servitude, eternal in their silence. The stars were no longer quiet. Where once there had been the vast, still silence of the void, now there was war. The galaxy itself trembled under the weight of the conflict that had engulfed it, an ancient war, fought not for conquest or glory, but for the very fabric of reality. On one side were the Necrons, cold and eternal, newly risen from their biotransference, their bodies of living metal, unyielding in the face of any foe. On the other side were the Old Ones, ancient beings of great psychic power, creators of many of the younger races, and custodians of the galaxy's future. Between them, the very stars burned. It was a war that had been inevitable, though neither side had known it at the time. For millennia, the Old Ones had ruled over the galaxy, their wisdom and knowledge shaping the course of countless civilizations. They were beings of immense psychic ability, able to manipulate the warp and shape reality to their will. They had created many of the galaxy's earliest races, nurturing them and guiding them along their paths. But, in their wisdom, The Old Ones had also sown the seeds of their own destruction, for they had never counted on the rise of the Necrons. The Necrontyr had long envied the Old Ones. While the Necrontyr had suffered beneath the cruel light of their dying sun, their lives short and filled with pain, the Old Ones had thrived. They had lived for millennia, their bodies and minds untouched by the ravages of time. To the Necrontyr, the Old Ones had seemed immortal, and their long lives had only deepened the bitterness that festered in the hearts of the Necrontyr. Now the Necrontyr were gone, transformed into the Necrons, their souls devoured by the Catan. They no longer felt envy, for they no longer felt anything at all. But their hatred of the Old Ones remained, burned into their cold, unfeeling minds like a brand. And under the command of the Catan, who had their own ancient grudges against the Old Ones, the Necrons marched to war. The war in heaven, as it would come to be known, began with a single strike. The Necrons, guided by the terrible power of the Catan, launched an assault on the worlds of the Old Ones, their legions descending upon the galaxy's most ancient and powerful civilizations with the cold efficiency of a machine. The Old Ones, masters of the warp, had never faced an enemy like the Necrons. Their fleets, powered by the energies of the Immaterium, were fast and agile, but they were not prepared for the sheer destructive power of the Necrons' Gorse weaponry. Planets were reduced to dust, their once thriving ecosystems stripped bare by the relentless fire of the Necron legions. The Old Ones, for all their power, were caught off guard. They had grown complacent, believing that their mastery of the warp would protect them from any threat. But the Necrons, newly forged in the fires of biotransference, had no need of the warp. They were creatures of the physical universe, their bodies of living metal, immune to the forces that the Old Ones had relied on for so long. The Necron ships cut through the Old Ones' defenses with brutal efficiency, and one by one their worlds began to fall. The war spread across the galaxy with terrifying speed. From one corner of the stars to the other, the Necrons advanced, their legions marching across the surface of ancient worlds, their Gorse weapons disintegrating anything in their path. The Old Ones, though powerful, struggled to contain the threat. Their psychic abilities, once so formidable, were of little use against the soulless Necrons, whose very existence seemed to defy the warp. And behind the Necrons, pulling the strings of the war like malevolent puppeteers, were the Catan. The Catan reveled in the destruction, their vast radiant forms drifting above the battlefields, feeding on the energies released by the carnage. They were gods of the stars, beings of pure energy, who had once devoured the light of suns, and now they feasted on the souls of the Old Ones and their creations. The Necrons, though powerful, were merely tools in the hands of the Catan, their will subsumed by the star gods who had remade them. But the Old Ones were not without hope. For all the power of the Necrons and the Catan, the Old Ones still possessed knowledge and wisdom far beyond that of any other race in the galaxy. They had shaped the very fabric of the warp, and though the Necrons were immune to its power, the Old Ones turned to the warp as their only hope of salvation. In the depths of the galaxy, the Old Ones began to create new life. Using their mastery of genetic engineering and psychic manipulation, they crafted new races, beings of immense psychic potential, who could stand against the Necrons and their Catan masters. Among these new creations were the ancestors of the Eldar, a race whose psychic abilities would one day rival even the Old Ones themselves. The Old Ones hoped that these new races, with their mastery of the warp, would be able to turn the tide of the war. At first, it seemed as though the Old Ones might succeed. The new races they had created took to the battlefield, their psychic powers blazing like stars as they fought against the Necrons. The warp itself seemed to rise in their defense, the Immaterium boiling and roiling as the psychic energy of the Old Ones' creations clashed with the cold, soulless power of the Necrons. Great battles were fought in the depths of space, where entire fleets of ships were torn apart by the fury of the warp, and on the surfaces of ancient worlds, where the earth itself cracked and split beneath the weight of the conflict. But for all the power of the Old Ones and their new creations, the Necrons and the C'tan were relentless. The Necrons felt no fear, no pain, no hesitation. Their legions marched forward with the cold mechanical precision of a machine, their Gauss weapons reducing their enemies to dust, their living metal bodies healing from even the most grievous wounds. The C'tan, meanwhile, feasted on the psychic energy unleashed by the war, growing ever more powerful as the conflict raged on. World after world fell to the Necrons. The Old Ones, once masters of the galaxy, were driven back, their civilizations crumbling under the relentless assault. The new races they had created fought bravely, but they were no match for the sheer power of the Necrons and their C'tan masters. The warp, once the Old One's greatest weapon, became a battleground in itself, as the Necron's soulless presence disrupted the flow of psychic energy, weakening the Old One's connection to the immaterium. It was a war that shook the very foundations of the galaxy. Entire star systems were consumed by the conflict, their suns extinguished, their planets reduced to barren husks. The Necrons, driven by the will of the C'tan, sought nothing less than the complete annihilation of the Old Ones and their creations. And for a time, it seemed as though they might succeed. But the Old Ones were not yet defeated. In the darkest days of the war, as their worlds burned and their people fell, they turned to one final, desperate plan. They would summon the full power of the warp, unleashing its fury in a last attempt to turn the tide. The Old One's mastery of the warp was unrivaled, and they believed that by channeling its energy, they could strike a blow against the Necrons that even the C'tan could not withstand. It was a gamble, a dangerous and reckless move that could just as easily destroy the Old Ones as save them. But with their empire on the brink of collapse, they had no other choice. The warp began to stir, its energies boiling to the surface as the Old Ones prepared to unleash their final weapon. The war in heaven was far from over, but the galaxy itself would bear the scars of the conflict for millennia to come. The war had raged across the galaxy for what seemed like an eternity, leaving stars darkened and entire civilizations extinguished. The Necron legions, relentless and soulless, had marched forward with the cold, unfeeling efficiency of machines, carving a path of destruction through the galaxy. At their backs, the C'tan drifted like gods, vast beings of radiant power, their hunger insatiable as they fed on the energies of stars and the psychic lifeblood of entire worlds. It was a time of despair, where even the most ancient and powerful of races, the Old Ones, struggled to hold back the tide of annihilation. But as the war in heaven dragged on, the Necrons, once proud and defiant even in their soulless forms, began to stir with something they had not felt for eons: resentment. For though they no longer knew fear or sorrow, they could still think, and in their minds they began to question the nature of the war they were waging. They had become eternal, undying, but in exchange they had lost everything. Their souls, their identities, even their wills had been subsumed into the cold logic of the Necron Empire. And yet, for all their power, they were not truly free. The C'tan, the star gods who had granted them their immortality, had enslaved the Necrons as surely as they had granted them life. The Necrons, for all their might, were little more than tools, pawns in the hands of the C'tan. They fought and destroyed not for themselves, but to feed the insatiable hunger of their gods. The C'tan, though magnificent and awe-inspiring, were creatures of pure consumption. They cared nothing for the Necrons beyond their usefulness in the war against the Old Ones, and their appetite for power grew with every battle, with every soul consumed. Szarekh the Silent King watched as his people marched across the stars, their minds bound to the will of the C'tan. He had led the Necrontyr into the pact with the star gods, driven by desperation to save his race from the curse of mortality. But now, as the war raged on, Szarekh saw with increasing clarity the true nature of the C'tan. They were not gods of benevolence or wisdom. They were predators, cosmic entities that sought only to consume, to feed on the life forces of the galaxy, and to grow ever more powerful. And the Necrons, for all their power, were nothing more than slaves to that hunger. In the silence of his own mind, Szarekh began to formulate a plan. He had been silent for so long, observing, calculating as was his way. But now, the time for silence was nearing its end. Szarekh knew that if his people were to be truly free, they would have to break the chains that bound them to the C'tan. It was a dangerous plan, for the C'tan were beings of unimaginable power. But the Silent King, cold and calculating, knew that power alone did not make one invincible. The C'tan had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated the Necrons. Though the Necrons had been remade in the image of the C'tan will, they still retained the sharp minds and ingenuity that had defined the Necrontyr. They were more than just soldiers. They were creators, engineers, and strategists. And in the cold depths of space, Szarekh began to gather his most trusted generals and lords, those who still possessed the ability to think beyond the commands of the C'tan. It was in these secret councils, held far from the gaze of the star gods, that the plan to betray the C'tan took shape. Szarekh knew that they could not hope to defeat the C'tan in open battle. The star gods were too powerful, their forms too vast and radiant, their essence bound to the very fabric of the stars. But Szarekh had learned something from watching the C'tan. Despite their power, they were not invincible. The C'tan, for all their cosmic grandeur, were made of energy, and energy could be contained. The Necrons, with their mastery of technology, began to forge new weapons, devices capable of containing the immense power of the C'tan. These devices, later known as Tesseract labyrinths, were created with a singular purpose: to imprison the star gods. Szarekh had studied the C'tan closely, learning their weaknesses, understanding the nature of their power. He knew that while the C'tan could not be killed by conventional means, they could be shattered, their immense energy divided into fragments and trapped. And so, the Silent King set his plan into motion. The betrayal came swiftly and without warning. The C'tan, in their arrogance, had never considered the possibility that their creations, their instruments of war, would turn against them. They believed themselves to be gods, beyond the reach of mere mortals, and in their hubris, they left themselves vulnerable. The Necron legions, once bound by the will of the C'tan, turned their weapons on their former masters. The first strike came at a decisive moment in the war, as the Necrons and the C'tan were preparing for a final assault on the heart of the Old One's remaining strongholds. The C'tan, drifting above the battlefield like radiant suns, were caught off guard as their Necron armies suddenly turned on them. The Tesseract labyrinths were deployed, devices of incredible power that could contain even the vast energy of a star god. The C'tan, for all their power, had no defense against this new weapon. One by one they were shattered, their forms breaking apart as the Necrons turned their might against their former gods. The battle was both awe-inspiring and terrible. The C'tan, who had once consumed entire stars with ease, were brought low by the very beings they had enslaved. Their radiant forms flickered and fractured, their energy spilling out into the void as the Necrons trapped them in the Tesseract labyrinths. Some of the C'tan, in their desperation, lashed out with the full force of their power, obliterating entire fleets of Necron ships in an instant. But it was too late. The trap had been sprung, and the Necrons, with their cold mechanical precision, carried out Sarekh's plan to perfection. One by one, the C'tan were imprisoned, their vast energies broken into shards and sealed away. The star gods, once so mighty, were now nothing more than fragments of their former selves, trapped in the devices that the Necrons had forged. The galaxy, which had once trembled at the sight of the Catan, now fell silent as the last of the star gods was shattered and imprisoned. Szarekh, the Silent King, stood victorious. The Necrons had broken their chains, had freed themselves from the control of the Catan, but it was not a victory that came without cost. The war in heaven had ravaged the galaxy, and though the Necrons were free from the control of the Catan, they were left with a hollow victory. The Catan, though imprisoned, were not truly defeated. Their fragments, though contained, still held immense power, and the Necrons, though no longer slaves, were still bound to their eternal existence, their souls lost forever to the hunger of the star gods. The galaxy lay in ruins, the old ones scattered and broken, their creations fleeing into the far corners of the stars. The Catan were shattered, imprisoned by the very beings they had sought to control. And the Necrons, for all their power, were left to contemplate the cost of their immortality. Szarekh, though victorious, felt the weight of his decisions more heavily than ever before. He had freed his people from one master, but they were still prisoners of their own eternal existence. The Catan had been betrayed, but the Necrons too had been betrayed. Betrayed by the promise of immortality that had cost them their souls. As the galaxy lay silent in the wake of the war, Szarekh knew that the Necrons' time was not yet over. But for now, they would retreat into the shadows, their vengeance against the Catan complete, their empire shattered but unbroken. The galaxy would heal, civilizations would rise and fall, but the Necrons would wait. They had all the time in the universe. The war was over, but there was no triumph to be found in the silence that followed. The stars, once bright and teeming with life, now flickered dimly over a galaxy scarred by eons of devastation. The Necrons had won their freedom from the Catan, those star gods who had enslaved them and fed upon their souls. The old ones, those once mighty architects of the galaxy's early civilizations, had been all but vanquished. Their creations, the younger races, had scattered, fleeing into the dark corners of the galaxy. And yet, despite all that had been gained, Szarekh, the Silent King, could feel no sense of victory. He stood at the edge of a great balcony in his palace, his cold metallic gaze sweeping across the shattered remnants of what had once been the heart of the Necron Empire. Beneath him, vast legions of his people stood in perfect formation, unmoving, their bodies gleaming in the faint starlight. They were a sight to behold, immortal, invulnerable, endless in number. But Szarekh knew the truth of what they had become. They were eternal, yes, but they were also hollow. The Necrons had gained immortality, but it had come at the cost of their very souls. Szarekh himself was no different. His mind was sharp, his body stronger than it had ever been when he was still flesh, but within him there was only emptiness. The biotransference, the process that had turned his people into these undying metal forms, had robbed them of what made them truly alive. Their emotions, their memories, even their identities had been dulled or erased entirely. Only the highest ranking among them, Szarekh included, retained a shadow of who they had once been. But even for them, the spark of life that had once burned so brightly had been extinguished. And so, the Silent King stood in the cold silence of his victory, knowing that it was a victory that meant nothing. The galaxy had been left in ruins, and with the old ones all but destroyed, there were no more enemies to fight, no more rivals to challenge the dominance of the Necrons. The Necron Empire stretched across the stars, vast and unbroken. But there was no future for it. There were no new worlds to conquer, no new horizons to reach. The Necrons had achieved what they had set out to do. They had escaped the curse of mortality that had plagued the Necrontyr for so long. But in doing so, they had lost their reason for living. For Szarekh, this realization had been slow in coming, creeping into his mind like a shadow as the war with the Old Ones dragged on. At first, he had believed that the defeat of their enemies and the shattering of the C'tan would bring his people the freedom they had sought for so long. But as the stars burned low and the fires of war began to fade, the truth became clear to him. The Necrons were not free. They were prisoners of their own immortality, bound to an existence without end, but also without purpose. It was a bitter truth, but one that Szarekh could not deny. The galaxy had grown cold, and with it, so had the future of the Necron race. The younger races, the creations of the Old Ones, would survive and rebuild in the far reaches of space, but the Necrons had no such future. Their empire, for all its power and grandeur, was doomed to stagnation. There was no life left in it, only an eternity of cold, unfeeling existence. And so Szarekh, in the quiet solitude of his thoughts, came to a decision. The Necron race could not continue as it was. They needed time to recover, to wait, and perhaps one day to rise again. But for now the Necrons would sleep. Szarekh would lead his people into the Great Sleep, a slumber that would last for millions of years, deep beneath the surface of countless tomb worlds scattered across the galaxy. There they would remain untouched by the ravages of time, waiting for the moment when the galaxy would be ready for them once more. It was not a decision that Szarekh made lightly. The Silent King had never been one to act without thought, without carefully weighing the consequences of his choices. But in this, he saw no other way. The Necrons had nothing left to fight for, no reason to continue their endless march across the stars. They had become little more than automatons, bound to a future that held no meaning. The Great Sleep, Szarekh believed, would offer them a chance. Perhaps not a chance to reclaim what they had lost, but a chance to find purpose again when the time was right. The preparations for the Great Sleep began in earnest. Across the Necron Empire, vast tomb complexes were constructed, deep beneath the surface of countless worlds. These tomb worlds would serve as the resting places of the Necron legions, hidden away from the eyes of the galaxy. The Necrons, their minds dulled by millennia of war and servitude, followed Sarekh's commands without question. They did not protest, for they no longer had the will to do so. They simply obeyed, their metal bodies moving with the precision of machines as they prepared for their long slumber. Szarekh, for his part, oversaw every detail of the preparations. He moved among his people, watching as the tombs were sealed, as the Necron legions marched in perfect silence into their stasis chambers. It was a scene that should have filled him with pride, for he had led his people to this point. He had given them immortality, had saved them from the curse of death that had once haunted them. But instead Szarekh felt only a deep gnawing sorrow. He had done what he had thought was right. He had made the choices that no one else could make, had borne the weight of those decisions alone. But now, as he watched the last of his people disappear into their tombs, he could not help but wonder if he had been wrong. Had the price of immortality been too high? Had he condemned his people to an existence worse than the death they had so feared? These were questions that had no answers, and Szarekh, for all his wisdom, could not dwell on them. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. As the final preparations were completed, Szarekh knew that there was one more task he had to undertake. The Great Sleep would not last forever. One day, far in the future, the Necrons would awaken, and when they did, they would need guidance. But Szarekh knew that he could not be the one to guide them. His guilt, the weight of what he had done, was too great. He could not lead his people into the future that awaited them. And so, Szarekh made the ultimate decision. He would exile himself. He would leave his people behind, disappearing into the void of the galaxy, alone. It was not an act of cowardice, but one of penance. Szarekh had led his people to this fate, and he could not stand by to witness what would become of them when they awoke. He would wander the stars, a silent, solitary figure, carrying the burden of his choices with him. With the last of the tombs sealed and the Necron legions entombed in their stasis chambers, Szarekh left his capital behind. He did not say farewell, for there was no one left to say it to. The Necrons, in their cold slumber, did not dream, did not remember. They would not miss him, just as they no longer remembered what it was to feel loss. Szarekh, the Silent King, disappeared into the darkness, leaving his empire behind. And so, the galaxy fell silent once more. The Necron tomb worlds hidden beneath the sands of 1,000 planets lay dormant, their legions sleeping beneath the surface, waiting for the day when they would rise again. For millions of years, the galaxy would forget them, unaware of the terrible force that slumbered just beneath its surface. But the Necrons would wait. They had all the time in the universe. The stars burned quietly, as they always had. In the black void of space, time flowed on, indifferent and endless, as it had since the galaxy's birth. Civilizations rose and fell, worlds were born and died. But in the shadows of the cosmos, beneath the shifting sands of forgotten planets, there lay something older than any empire, older even than most stars themselves. Hidden in the depths of tomb worlds scattered across the galaxy, the Necrons slept. It was a silent slumber, one without dreams, without thought. For millions of years, the Necrons had lain dormant, their legions locked in vast, cold stasis chambers, each one a metal shell that held within it the mind of a once-living being. These beings had not always been like this. Once, they had been the Necrontyr, a race of flesh and blood, plagued by the curse of mortality and driven by a desperate quest for survival. But that had been a long time ago, before they had made their terrible pact with the C'tan, before the biotransference had stripped them of their souls and remade them as immortal, soulless machines. Now the Necrons lay entombed, their bodies of living metal undying, their minds frozen in the stillness of the great sleep. In the deep silence of their tomb worlds, no sound could disturb them. No force could stir them from their long slumber. They were timeless, bound to the eternal march of the stars, waiting for the day when they would awaken once more. And so, the galaxy carried on, oblivious to the power that rested just beneath its surface. In the time since the Necrons had sealed themselves away, the galaxy had changed. The old ones, their ancient foes, were gone, their civilizations shattered and scattered to the winds of time. Their great works, the younger races they had created to fight in the war in heaven, had endured, some thriving, others barely clinging to existence. Among these races were the Eldar, once the greatest of the Old One's creations, their psychic power unmatched, their empire spanning the stars. But even they, for all their power and wisdom, had begun to fade, their empire crumbling under the weight of its own decadence. Other races had risen in the wake of the Old One's downfall. The Imperium of Man, a vast and sprawling empire built on the backs of 1 trillion souls, now dominated much of the galaxy. But for all its power, for all its legions of soldiers and fleets of warships, the Imperium knew little of what lay beneath the sands of 1,000 tomb worlds. They knew of the Eldar, they knew of the Orcs and the Tyranids, but of the Necrons, they knew nothing. To them, the Necron tombs were nothing more than ancient ruins, forgotten by time, their true nature lost to history. For millions of years, the Necrons had waited in silence, their tomb worlds untouched by the passing of time. Civilizations had come and gone, but the Necrons remained, eternal and unchanging. The galaxy had forgotten them, but they had not forgotten the galaxy. Deep within the stasis chambers of their tombs, the minds of the Necron lords still stirred, their thoughts cold and calculating, untouched by the ravages of emotion. They had waited for so long, but the Silent King had ensured that they would wait for longer still. Szarekh, the Silent King, had been the one to make the fateful decision. It was he who had led the Necrontyr into the biotransference, and it was he who had seen the terrible cost of their immortality. The C'tan had given them eternal life, but they had taken everything else, their souls, their individuality, their freedom. And so Szarekh had led his people into the Great Sleep, not as a final act of defeat, but as a means of survival. He had known that the galaxy would change, that new powers would rise and fall, and that one day the time would come for the Necrons to awaken and reclaim their place among the stars. But that time had not yet come. For now the Necrons remained hidden, their tomb worlds lying beneath the sands of forgotten planets, undisturbed by the chaos that raged across the galaxy. Wars were fought, empires clashed, and still the Necrons slept. It was a sleep that stretched on for millennia, and in that time the galaxy forgot. The tombs, once the great cities of the Necrontyr Empire, were buried by the shifting sands, their entrances sealed by the passage of time. The galaxy moved on, and the Necrons became nothing more than a distant memory, a myth whispered by the few who still remembered. But the Necrons were patient. They had all the time in the universe. Beneath the surface of countless worlds, the tombs remained intact, their stasis chambers humming with the faint energy that sustained the Necron legions. The tomb worlds were quiet, their inhabitants still and silent, but they were not dead. The Necrons could not die. They were bound to eternity, their bodies of living metal impervious to the passage of time. And so they waited, and as they waited, the galaxy continued its march toward chaos. The Imperium of Man, for all its power, was beset on all sides by enemies. The Eldar, once proud and mighty, had fallen into decline, their empire reduced to scattered remnants. The Orcs rampaged across the stars, and the Tyranids, a threat from beyond the galaxy itself, consumed all in their path. It was a galaxy in turmoil, a galaxy on the brink of collapse. But the Necrons remained unmoved by the chaos of the younger races. They had seen the rise and fall of empires before, and they knew that no matter what happened in the galaxy above, they would endure. The younger races were fleeting, their lives brief and insignificant in the grand scheme of the universe. The Necrons, by contrast, were eternal, their existence stretching across the eons, untouched by the petty conflicts of the living. Still, the Necrons knew that their time would come again. Szarekh had foreseen it. The Silent King, though long gone, had laid the groundwork for their eventual return. The Great Sleep would not last forever. One day, when the time was right, the tomb worlds would stir, and the Necron legions would rise from their slumber. And when they did, the galaxy would tremble. For now, though, the galaxy remained unaware of the threat that lay beneath its surface. The Necrons, their metal bodies gleaming in the darkness of their tombs, slept on, waiting for the day when they would awaken once more. The galaxy might have forgotten them, but the Necrons had not forgotten the galaxy. And so the stars burned quietly, as they always had. The galaxy turned, empires rose and fell, and the Necrons, timeless and eternal, waited in silence.